This is a look at our free class composite generator, and here I already have one laid out just to show what it could look like. This particular one has a background image in it, and it's set to an 8x10 with the image ratio for each one of the pictures to be a 5x7. All of this can be edited and changed over here under settings. So just some of the settings that we have here is what size you would like it to be, various different sizes, as well as a custom size where you could enter in your own width and height. Mostly I've been testing this out with an 8x10 and it so far has worked great. If you try one of the other ones, there could be a glitch here and there, and please let us know if you see something like that. Image ratio is just the proportion of whatever the images are going to show up on the class composite. 5x7 to me is the best looking one, but there's a couple others in here. And then you have the number of rows and the number of columns. Generally, this is automatically figured out for you at what the system thinks would work best, and then you can tweak it from there. If we click reset here, right, it doesn't do the math perfectly, and it's got one image down there on the bottom. I didn't like that, so I increased it here. And then the number of rows, there's some complication going on here with what goes on the top. I have the top row as a custom row, and that is not counted as an actual row. And if I decrease this down to 3, it'll take up the space better. Hard to control all of the different variations that you could have in here. You have to play around with it to get something that looks really good. Sometimes it comes out perfect, other times it doesn't. It has to do with the number of images you have and whatnot. So the top row handling is whether or not you want images on the top or not. If you say normal, then the text, you might have some trouble getting the text to show up. You'd probably have to put a page margin at the top to move everything down, and then you could have the text going straight across the top. By default, you get 3 lines of text. You can change that down at the bottom. The different text box, you could remove them. I can remove this bottom one, or you could add another one. And then they all have different settings for the font and the size. The first one is default set to sort of a title font, and the other one's to a smaller font. And then under the page background, you could, so while this does a lot of cool stuff, it's definitely limited to what you could do. In Photoshop, you could do a lot more cool stuff. So it's possible you could change the background to be transparent and then not bother with the text here. And then you would get the image cell and the file name, and then everything would be transparent. You could drop that in to Photoshop to fiddle around with afterwards to do whatever you want. Let's go back to being white background, change this back to 8 and that back to 3. When you do the top row handling, you can tell it how many cells you want it to fill in. We'll say 4. And that gives you sort of a nice even layout. If you think the space on the sides is wrong, you can go down to the image settings and you could make the horizontal spacing larger. That would spread it all out. You could also make the vertical spacing smaller, which has the effect of giving you more space to make the images larger. Sometimes it looks like you should be able to say, I want the images to be 10% larger. That doesn't really work based on what the margins are, because you might say there's a bunch of space down at the bottom or on the sides, but you have to take into account that if you make these images larger, it takes up both at the same time. Sometimes I look at it and I wonder why it is the way it is, and you have to remember that, well, there isn't any more space going horizontally, so it can't make more space vertically. That's where you could change the image ratio a little bit, do something a little skinnier to make them taller. You can also change the vertical, and the horizontal spacing is what I usually find helps fill in the layout. So some other things you got here is cell background. So basically there's always a background behind the image that carries underneath to where the text is. Generally, I don't like that. So we need to give back the vertical spacing, and now you can sort of see what's going on. If I change the background color to sort of a light gray, then you can see what's really happening with the cell background. Generally, I have it off, but if you want to have a background behind it, this would help with an image. If you drop in an image as a background and you really want to see the image show up, that's a little too busy for this type of thing. See if there's something simpler. I was just playing around with building backgrounds. Right, maybe we'll just pretend that's the sky. Then you can see how the cell background really could help. Keep in mind that has a lot of issues with the file size, the font size of the names that are underneath the file. You can tweak some of that under the file name label. You could turn it off if you don't want the file name down below. And the file name here down below, if we go back to the images tab, I actually haven't shown you this yet. Let's start over again and add in some images. Go back to our cat class and I'll select a bunch. Maybe not that many. And when it brings in the images, I have them mostly all named as last name, comma, first name. That's what it's expecting. And if it sees a comma in the file name, it will take everything up to the comma and assume that that's the last name. So it will split it apart and put it after whatever the rest of the file name is. If you don't name your files last name, comma, first name, and you just name them without the comma, Ron Dyer, that's me. And then it will just automatically take that as the actual name to put below the image. And then this little text box below all of them allows you to overwrite it. So maybe you didn't name your files beforehand. You could name them here. But you really should rename them before you open them in here, because what it's doing is sorting all of the files alphabetically by the file name. And if the file name starts with the last name, then you get nice alphabetical by last name sorting when you're in the template. Whew, how did we get so small there? We got so many images, and it looks like we've got some vertical spacing here. That's a little much. And then we got one image down there by itself. There we go. That looks a lot better. So see how this sorts all of the images by the person's last name, which to me is the best way to sort them. If you do them on your own and just name them first space last.jpg, then they're going to sort by the first name. Whatever the first character in the file name is how it will sort. Once you're in here and you want something to change, you can move it over by using these arrow buttons, but that's redoing the sorting. You could also say somebody's staff, and that will move them to the front. It will also give them a separate title you could add underneath them. Let's resort everything in case I got it messed up. And let's go back out to the layout. Back to the image cell. There's cell corners. Right. By default, it's set to rounded but minimal. You got a rounded medium, rounded max. The oval, which is kind of interesting. Oval doesn't really work very well with the cell background. If you turn off the cell background and make it transparent, and then let's say you go back to a white background, then the oval works pretty good. There's also the stroke color that goes around it. The width really isn't in pixels. 3 pixels, I believe, is what it is when it's 1. And that's what I would set it at if I was going to do it at anything. You can actually turn it off and just have it be 0. You can change the font that's underneath the images, but be careful with how this interacts with what the font size is. So the font size, let me change some of this back. So the font size is sort of a weird setting. When you bring in all the images into the layout, it does something where it looks at the space that you have, the width of what the image is going to be, and then it calculates the font based on a fixed number of characters for like what an average maximum first name plus last name might be. It isn't perfect, but it gets you sort of a normalized value of what the font size should be. It's not automatic. So if you had a class that had a bunch of people with short names, the font size could be a lot bigger. But to me, that might look weird when you get back to a normal class with a bunch of longer names. The font size seems like it might jump around. So I have it set to sort of normalize it based on sort of a long name like this Robert one. You can override that and make the font size larger, and as you do so, it will tell you if it thinks that the line of text is going to exceed the width of the image. In this case, since I have the cell backgrounds turned off, that actually doesn't matter. But if you have it turned on, then you wouldn't want this as clipping the name on some of the longer names. Something to be aware of, it will tell you that it's getting large and it's going to just extend out past. See, now these ones are running down below. They're running together. That's not good. But you could probably get away with something like this, where it's fine that this person's name extends out past the edges because there's plenty of room. The system itself can't really judge how that's going to work, so we leave it up to you, but give you a little bit of a warning. There's also a warning if you don't have enough columns and rows, so it's telling you there's one image not showing, and up here at the top is telling you how many total images there are. So when you're done fiddling around with it, you could have some text up there. Whatever you text, you can just type in there. It also has text box down here, so if I type in here, that will also show up here, and this is where the settings are for this. You could bump this down, and whatever the margin is on the top one, the other lines respect that. So they also went down at the same time as I made this one go down. You could change the color, so if you had the background as black, you could change the font here to white. You could also do different font styles, and again, you can change the font here. Again, be careful with how this is going to show up. It's possible that one of the characters might go outside the bounds of what the text box is. I think I have them all working pretty well, but that's something to be on the lookout for. Same thing as the text. Before you made 40 prints of this particular image, you would want to make sure that you double check everything and that the text isn't running in or it's not getting clipped in some way. Same with the text at the top. Once you have everything the way you like it, you can just click the download button, and it will download a 300 pixels per inch version of the same thing you're seeing on the screen. And the way this is made is technically different than what you're seeing in the layout. It's possible that there is some difference in here in the way something works, but so far to me it looks very close to identical. But again, something to be on the lookout for is just to make sure this looks good after you download it. So that's about it. There's a lot of options you can play around with here. All of the cell corner stuff and the backgrounds and the background image. I guess I didn't show one thing about the background image. You can control saturation, opacity, and the blur. So if you have, I don't know, some other picture of the baseball field or something, you could blur it out or something very easily in here. You can also just lower the opacity. Again, that image they dropped in there's a little too busy for something like this. But something else, maybe it could be the school logo or something that's in the background. You could desaturate it, lower the opacity, or blur it, just to give the background something that's a little bit more interesting than a solid color.